Good evening and welcome to the 171st monthly meeting of FOSWL, Hyderabad. And as usual, I'd like to say FOSWL stands for Friends on Same Wavelength. And this is the 15th year of FOSWL Hyderabad. While it is essentially for senior citizens, you can see a lot of young people like Nitin and Anand and me, on the call, on the meeting. So we would encourage you to join us every third Saturday of the month. We unfailingly we have had an unbroken record of meetings every third Saturday, including during the COVID period for the last 14 years. This organization was founded by one Mr. M.L. Swami, the first engineer-in-chief of the then United Andhra Pradesh, government of Andhra Pradesh, after his retirement when he was in Cupertino, California, over 20 odd years ago. And my father, who's on the call, Mr. Venkateswararao Tipirneni, in whose name is the endowment lecture this year, he founded the Hyderabad chapter, which was the first international chapter of FOSWL. We have chapters in multiple locations now. In Chennai, we have 2, Bangalore, Bombay. Not all of them are very active, but many of them are. Vijayawada is very active, and Irvine in California, Southern California. So with that introduction, I'd like to remind you again, if you're attending for the first time, please type in your email address, your name, email address, and mobile phone number, so we can add you to the group, the email group and the WhatsApp group, so that you get future invites. May I now request our Joint Secretary, Mr. Somasekhararao, to read the prayer to commence the meeting, please.
Thank you. Heaven of freedom, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where the knowledge is free, where the world has not broken into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where the words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by the into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake.
Thank you, Somasekhararao. Every monthly meeting of FOSWL is an endowment lecture in the name of someone. Most of them are our members. And this month's endowment lecture is in the names of my parents, Mr. Venkateswararao Tipirneni, who's on the call. He is the president of FOSWL, founder president of FOSWL Hyderabad, and my mother, Mrs. Nirmala Tipirneni. Now, to give you a very brief introduction of his life and work, my father was a builder, a Class A contractor, as it's known in India. He was a freedom fighter and escaped being jailed because he was 14 years old. At the time, he participated in the freedom struggle in his village in the then combined state of Andhra Pradesh. He was a very good singer. He was a stage actor. In fact, he acted in many plays with a popular Telugu actor called Akkineni Nageswararao, who used to don the role of a woman in those days because he had a voice which suited that role. And my father would play the male role because he had a good voice to sing. And he was trained in the Gandhi ashram in those days in the freedom struggle, and he became very close to Acharya Ranga. And some of the people who know the freedom struggle know Professor N.G. Ranga, who founded the Swatantra Party. Earlier, it was Justice Party along with a few people, but then Swatantra Party. And he's a fierce nationalist. And in profession, he built many of the infrastructure projects in the post-independence era of India. To name a few, he built a road through the sea to connect what is now known as the Sriharikota rocket launching station, from which India launches all its satellites. It was a very difficult 18-kilometer road in the sea to reach that island. And even today, many of the satellites are launched from the rocket launching pad that he had built, I think in 72 to 74, that time frame. And Sudhakar is here, who is the former chairman of ECL. He built many significant parts of Electronics Corporation of India in Hyderabad, nuclear fuel complex, Hindustan cables, and the like. And naturally, because of his work in different places, he was constantly away from home, traveling, and my mother was a big support, and she took care of all four of us. And they both live together here, very close to us in Hyderabad. And this every month March lecture is dedicated to their life and work. So I'm happy to share these few details about my parents. May now invite Nitin to tell us a bit about Dr. Vikas Sukhatme, who's our distinguished speaker for today. Nitin?
Good morning and good evening. It's my privilege and singular pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dr. Vikas Sukhatme. He was Dean of the Emory Medical School till March of this year. After 5 years, I think he stepped down from his administrative duties. He's still a full professor there. He's also a member of the Board of Overseers at Harvard, having spent many years at the Harvard Medical School. He has over 40 years experience in the medical field. His awards, publications, honors are far too numerous to mention here, but I'm sure you can Google it and there'll be a long list of his achievements. So I won't go through those. He and his wife, Vidula, are very passionate about bringing potentially ignored affordable solutions in the field of medical innovation, especially as it relates to cancer and so on. So this is something that's very near and dear to both their hearts, and I know they have sort of a separate organization working on it. On a personal level, they have, over the last couple of years since they moved to Atlanta, I've been privileged to call them family friends. So I think we are in for a treat and look forward to a very engrossing talk and hopefully lots of questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Vikas.
Thank you, Nitin. And I'd like to also welcome Vikas' older brother and his wife, as well as Dr. Vikas' wife herself. Very glad to have all of you on this call. Vikas, the floor is yours. You can share your screen and start the presentation.
All right. So for some reason, this is not moving forward. So I just restarted it again. Maybe I'll try again.
Did you email it to me?
I did.
Okay, then I'll also see if it doesn't work, I can open mine.
All right, let me do this. We'll try once more here.
Sure.
See if this works. Oh, there we go. All right. Okay, I think we are ready to go.
Okay, good.
All right, so thank you very much, Sukhatme. It's great to know you and your family as well. And thank you, Nitin. Much appreciate the very kind and generous introductions. So the title of this brief talk is Unleashing Rapid, Affordable Medical Innovation. And this is a topic I've been interested in now for some time. And it's basically an inconvenient truth. Some of you may recognize this slide. It is from a documentary that was made many years ago in which former Vice President of the US, Al Gore, was trying to tell the public about this impending threat of global warming. I'm not sure he was listened to all that much, though things finally have picked up momentum. And as you know, a lot of action is now taking place to address this issue. So similarly, I believe we have an inconvenient truth here. And that is that there exist all kinds of interesting, scientifically promising ideas for treatment of a variety of diseases that are not being developed forward, they're not moving forward because there is insufficient financial incentive. So we wrote a blog about this a while ago, actually, and we referred to these ideas as financial orphans or medical financial orphans. So these come in a whole variety of different buckets. There are three big ones. The first bucket is all drugs that are already on the market. In the US, these would be drugs that are approved by the FDA, but have now expired in terms of their patent life. So they are generic drugs, off-patent, FDA-approved drugs. In principle, these drugs could be put to a new use, not the original use for which they were approved. So you could think of a blood pressure medication, and you might say, gee, there is some evidence that those who happen to have cancer, who happen to be on this blood pressure medication, you might notice that they have better outcomes. They have better survival, for example, or better quality of life. And that's the kind of evidence, we'll talk about this a little bit more. That's the kind of evidence that might first suggest that that blood pressure medication may be useful in the treatment of cancer patients. I'll give you other examples in a few minutes. The second major category of these financial orphans is substances that you can go on Amazon or wherever you want to go at your drugstore and buy. And these are often referred to as generally recognized as safe supplements. Some are herbal products, meaning mixtures, and some are pure compounds. For example, vitamin D or vitamin C, for example. And then another major category is lifestyle changes, diet, exercise, stress control, and so on. So if I were to show you some data that eating less sugar, if you happen to have certain kinds of cancer, might benefit you, meaning provide a greater survival advantage, that is not a trial that a drug company is going to sponsor for obvious reasons. There's no money to be made by telling somebody to eat less sugar or to modify their diet in some other way. So these are the major categories of these financial orphans. There are others as well. And we have tended to focus our attention on the first category, the drugs that have no longer on patent. Some people have asked me and said, look, we can file a patent on a new use of a drug. And would that not be something then that the for-profit sector could take up? And the answer theoretically is yes. From a practical standpoint, many of these patents are very hard to enforce. In other words, if I said that a certain blood pressure medication could be used for cancer, it'd be impossible to recoup any costs of that from an insurance company, essentially. And furthermore, if that medication is used by millions of people outside of the cancer field, the extra revenue from that, even if you could enforce the patent, would be tiny. Moreover, many cases, people have published data of the type I just described, and once a publication is in place, as you know, it is a little late to file a patent, at least in some countries, and in some cases, there's a year's leeway. So for all of those reasons, these new indication patents tend to be weak or not filed at all. So, excuse me, the real tragedy of this whole thing is actually very simple. And that is that what we are talking about today are ideas that are absolutely ready to test. They're ready to test because all of the things I've mentioned to you are available today. This does not require anybody to wait to implement one or more of these things. Many of the ideas are incredibly affordable. The medications we're talking about, the supplements we're talking about, typically cost a few dollars, a few rupees, and pale in terms of cost compared in many cases to the original cost of or the indicated cost of the treatment that is currently available. Furthermore, these are widely available. There is no country in the world that doesn't have access to the kind of things that we're talking about. And so these three features, the ability to implement immediately, the affordability, and the wide availability, means that if any of what I'm saying makes sense and works out and is validated by appropriate studies, it will have global impact. And that to us is what is quite exciting about what I'm telling you today. So let's just step back, excuse me, let's just step back and look at how new therapies reach patients. And this is true whether you're in the US or whether you're in India. And that is that typically, there is some data in animal models. We refer to that as preclinical data, any data that is not in humans. It could be in cell culture. It could be in animal models. There is some hint of some drug, or well, first of all, you identify a so-called target. It is the molecular entity that you're trying to attack, if you will. And then there is a search for suitable molecules that might do what you want it to do. And so you show efficacy and some safety in animal studies. You then proceed, and this is where money is required, and considerable money. Money is required for the preclinical data, but even more money, typically single-digit dollars to start off, single-digit millions of dollars to start off with, going on to, single-digit millions of dollars to start off with, and then going on to tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to execute the proper clinical studies to put a drug or a potential drug to get a potential drug to the market. Only then does it become in routine use in patients. So let's look at that in a little more detail. This is a rough drug development timeline in the for-profit sector. Basic research goes on, discovery research, as I've told you, this is all preclinical work on the lower left for many years. And tens and hundreds of thousands of compounds are looked at. These are referred to as libraries, medical libraries, and there are many kinds of these. And out of that come about 100 or so compounds that are further refined down to literally 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 compounds that go ultimately into humans. There are 3 phases of trials. There's a so-called phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Phase 1's goal is to do the trial in a few patients. Sometimes they are not patients, they're volunteers who do not have the disease. But in the cancer situation, most of these are cancer patients. And in these phase 1 trials, the goal is to ascertain safety, to ascertain feasibility, and maybe even to get a hint of whether the drug is actually working. In other words, efficacy. Phase 2 trials are more driven towards the efficacy endpoint, and phase 3 trials are the so-called definitive studies. Many of them are randomized, in which pharma believes in, and the FDA believes in, and if lucky, and all goes well, the FDA will approve, and provide market authorization. And then there is a phase 4, which I won't get into right now, that's often referred to as a post-marketing phase. So these are the phases. You can see the years, the timeline below. It takes a decade to bring a new drug to the market. And so what I'm referring to here, especially in that first category of drugs, generic drugs that are already FDA approved, is often referred to as drug repurposing or drug repositioning. And as you might guess, it can remove or lop off a number of years and costs in moving that drug forward for the new indication. In other words, we often know the safety profile quite well since the drug has been used in millions of people for whatever it's being used for typically. We can often therefore jump straight to a phase 2 study, for example. But it still begs the question of who is going to shepherd all of this forward. So again, just to point out, it's an expensive business, clinical studies. It's often inefficient. What I didn't point out to is that only 1 out of 10 drugs that enter human studies, only 1 out of 10 approximately get FDA approval. And it is lengthy, as you've seen. So these are the issues. And because of these issues, it is only reasonable. And just to be clear, we are not here saying that there is anything wrong with what biotech or pharma does. It's just that what we are talking about is not in their space. For them to get excited to undertake these clinical studies, they have to have a way of recouping their costs. And the only way they can do that is if there is intellectual property that is involved, so that they can get some, for a period of time, at least some price exclusivity. In determining whether to invest or not, a pharma company will also look at market size. They will look at the chances of success. If the idea is quite crazy or is in a disease where we poorly understand what's going on, pharma often will not invest because the chances of success are low. So the return on investment is naturally looked at. These are only some of the criteria. There are others. And if the ROI is not high enough in the view of whoever's looking at this, that therapy, that idea will languish. And we now refer to it as the financial orphan, as I've said. So you might say, well, how do you come upon these financial orphans? How do you identify these in the first place? The first is to look at retrospective human data. This is exactly what I said a few minutes ago. Somebody notices that in hundreds of thousands of patients treated with a certain drug, with a certain type of cancer, for example, but this, by the way, all of what I'm telling you can apply outside of cancer as well. We have happened to have focused on cancer and more recently on COVID and long COVID. But all of what I'm telling you is applicable to other diseases as well. So one looks at retrospective human data, and our retrospective data simply gives you a few hints that it might be that if you're on a certain drug, along with the standard of care, there are better outcomes. And that sort of gets the ball rolling. Then somebody can say, well, all right, let me go back and devise an animal model and ask the question in an animal model or multiple animal models of the disease in question. Do I get better outcomes if I give the drug intentionally? And you do this in one group of animals, and in the other group of animals you don't, and you look for a difference in outcomes. You also try to understand in these animal studies how the drug might be working. It might be working in the same way that it was originally approved for, or it might be doing something completely different, just by chance. This drug happens to hit a pathway, so to speak, that is relevant for another disease. So we start learning about how the drug might work. And then somebody out there says, wait a minute, let me just take this patient and give them the drug. And they report out some interesting things, saying, hey, this guy was on death's door and turned around, and the only thing I did was to give this additional drug on top of the standard of care. Or the patient's disease has progressed despite the best care, and they go on one or more of these drugs and things start looking better, at least stabilize for a while, for example. So those are case reports or case series when they get published. And then somebody might say, well, look, this looks promising enough. Let me write to the government, let me write to a foundation, probably not a pharma company, but at least let's start a small study, a small pilot, a phase 1, or maybe even a phase 2 study. And so the literature is filled with these ideas that have done one or more or fulfill one or more of these criteria. Typically, there will not be a phase 3 study, because if there were a phase 3 study, we would definitively know whether this intervention works or doesn't work. So most of these data end with a phase 1 or a phase 2 at best. So this is the big picture takeaway. I just want to take a minute again, make sure we're all on the same wavelength, that there are large unmet needs in medicine. There are many diseases for which the therapies are expensive, in some cases fairly toxic, and in some cases only modestly effective. And so there is an enormous opportunity here to do what I have indicated to you, to take ideas that have some promise based on the kind of data I've just shown you and develop them further, meaning conduct clinical trials as an example. I think there are several avenues and ways of having impact. I'm going to come back to this in just a few minutes, but that's the big picture. And so we began, we in this case is my wife, Vidula, and myself. We founded an organization, a nonprofit called Global Cures, now over nearly 15 years ago. And we got a little bit of traction here and there. We connected with various agencies and people and raised some money and so on and so forth, and started thinking through what are the potential interventions. And we focused on cancer, and we started creating a database. The word gradually got around. We didn't enroll in any clinical trials. We didn't propose any clinical trials. And we came to Emory with a promise of some funding from the university, which they did provide us with. And then we were able to land a considerable gift from Gerald Chan. This was announced publicly at Emory University. It was a $10 million gift that really got the ball rolling. Gerald Chan is a billionaire from Hong Kong originally. He gave the largest gift in Harvard's history. We got to know him quite well in Boston, and took him a couple of years since we left Boston to give us the gift here at Emory University. So the center was started. It's called the Morningside Center in honor of the fund that he runs for innovative and affordable medicine. And what we did is we brought in all of the work that we've been doing in Global Cures, and we've extended that work in scope and in size. And our goal, our deliverables of the Morningside Center are really, is really singularly one, and that is to publish data in high quality journals so that the intervention that we're talking about will be incorporated into clinical treatment guidelines. In other words, will become widely available and executed on for patients. And ideally also will be reimbursed. Typically, guidelines for clinical treatment are provided by national agencies. So in the cancer area, there is an agency known as NCCN. There's another one known as the American Society of Clinical Oncology, ASCO. And once they buy into this, insurance companies typically say, okay, we are all set. We will reimburse these costs for treatments. So that's really the goal. The goal is not to seek FDA approval for a new drug indication. That has its own complexities. And here, that is not our goal. And the FDA has very complex regulatory issues around how you get a new drug approved for a new indication, even if it's approved for one indication. So we are not after that. What we are saying is, let's do the work, let's get it published in a proper venue, and it will, we hope, and we are quite sure, will influence national guidelines. So there are following on that, there are three things we're doing in the Morningside Center over the last 3-4 years. The first is to enlarge on that database. What interventions are we talking about? And not just by intervention, because there are several others around the world who are starting to think along these lines, but not just by intervention, in other words, by drug, but actually by disease, by type of disease. So if somebody said to you, so-and-so has stage 4 pancreatic cancer, has never been treated before, turns out so-called stage 4 pancreatic cancer is a pretty bad prognosis, pretty bad disease to have. We will tell you the following 5 papers in the world's literature that suggests that adding A, B, C, or D with the treatment might make a difference. It won't be definitive. It'll be retrospective studies. It'll be some animal studies. It'll be all of the things I just told you. But at least there will be a website you can go to and say, if so-and-so had this disease at this stage of the disease, here are supporting data that back up the use of A, B, C, or D. We will make this database available publicly. It is moving along fairly well. There's a lot of work, as you might imagine here. And as part of that database, we also we'll be putting forward a so-called prioritization scheme. In other words, which of these ideas do we think are ready to go for additional studies? Then I'll tell you a bit about how we expect to have clinical impact and a bit about what we are doing under advocacy. So these are the 3 arms of what we are doing in the Morningside Center. So here they are explained in a little more detail. I actually sort of jumped ahead a little bit, but these are the 3 basic pieces. And let me take you through some of these in a little more detail. So the database, the first database we are constructing is around cancer. This is a tall order, as you might imagine, since there are many kinds of cancers, and one has to, the treatments vary depending on the stage of the disease. I'll give you a cancer 101 in just a few minutes. So if I had one slide to summarize the treatment of cancer, you'll see that in a minute. So we are creating this database, and we're organizing it by intervention and by disease. We have a scheme which we think helps us vocalize what should have priority. We're engaging with some folks at Georgia Tech, which is next door to us, to develop natural language processing methods so that we don't have to do the tedious task of actually looking through all the world's literature, looking through social media, looking through all kinds of things. And of course, there's a lot of help these days from that angle. And so at the end of the day, the goal of this is to aid in the design of clinical studies, as well as to provide information in case a physician wants to do these outside of a clinical trial, so-called off-label treatments. So, and we think this will also be useful for patients to take to their physicians and say, hey, have you seen this? We know the data is not perfect, but does this make sense for me? So the way we expect to have clinical impact, and this is, of course, you know, the sort of the heart of the organization, if you will, and the heart of the effort that we're making, is twofold. And this is a little bit complicated, but I'll just sort of take you through it. The first is, in fact, to do clinical trials, right? So basically to You set up a protocol, design a protocol and say, hey, here is for this disease, for cancer at this stage, here is the standard of care. Here, if you want to do it as a randomized study, one group of patients will be randomized to, there'll be the control arm, there'll be the standard of care. The other one will be standard of care, for example, plus intervention X. We will enroll so many patients. Excuse me, this is the dose that we will use, the schedule we will use, these are the blood tests we will do, and these are the endpoints we will look at. We will look at how long the patient survives. We will look at the quality of their life based on a number of questionnaires and so on. So that is, as you see here on the left, a trial, a classical trial. Now it turns out there are some fancy new ways of doing trials that I'll come back to in a second. But the old-fashioned way of doing trials, has nothing wrong with them. And we expect to initiate, and we have initiated 6 such trials in cancer at Emory itself. So some of this will happen at Emory, and there's no reason why it can't happen anywhere else in parallel. We can share these protocols with others. They will have to get their own funding, of course, but we can even do some of the blood tests. Instead of spending the money at the other institution, we're willing to do some of that here at Emory, if those specimens can be transferred. So this is how we can start at Emory, and we can go to other institutions as well. And we are more than happy to share all of the protocols that we have going on. There are 6 now that are ongoing. There are 6 more that are in development. And there are another dozen that we are funding where the ideas came from outside of us. But it is a challenge. You have to write the protocol. You have to do everything that pharma does and literally feed it to the investigators. They don't have the time many times to do these things. So we have to design it. We have to identify who they are. We have to write the protocol, obtain internal review board approval, and all the rest of that. And of course, at the end of the day, we have to have the money to do the study. So as you might expect, most of these are phase 1 and phase 2 studies that we are funding here at Emory. Then I refer to something which I refer to here as TCRs, which is that there are patients and situations who don't have time to wait, where the patient does not have time to wait. And so a physician is legally allowed, and let me emphasize that again, a physician is in the US, is legally allowed to prescribe, and I'm quite sure the same is true in India, a drug that is already approved by the FDA for an indication different from the one for which the drug got FDA approval. That is referred to as off-label drug use. That is that is the prerogative of the physician in conjunction with the patient in a shared decision-making. Furthermore, let me just say that you can't just do that willy-nilly. The physician has to have some data to suggest that the drug intervention makes sense. That level, that bar though, is very low. If the physician has retrospective data, and so our database becomes useful for this purpose, that's good enough. If there is a case series, a case report, even if there's only animal data, that is adequate if the physician and patients agree. And we refer to these as treatments. But what we would like, off-label treatments, but what we would like to do is to couple those treatments with a national registry which predefines outcomes and what happens, so that if physicians were to do this around the US or in India, there would be ways in which the endpoints, in other words, what happens to the patient, could be extracted out of that data and put in a registry, in an anonymized way, of course. In that way, we would learn from those experiences. So these are 2 parallel tracks for clinical impact that we believe make sense. And the second one on the right-hand side could be executed at a community level. This does not need a large academic center like ours at Emory. This can be done in the community. And again, there are certain barriers. I'll come back to that, but there's no reason why this cannot be done. And some of these will be, and so these are often referred to as decentralized trials or decentralized approaches, whether it be in trials or whether they be off-label treatment. So what is exciting, and you heard me say that we've been at this for a little while, but what is exciting is that there are new tools and technologies that have arrived. And thanks to COVID, or thanks to whatever era we are living in, The whole concept of running trials or running treatments that are at a national level and then collecting that data is no longer foreign. We've done it at the time of COVID. It can be done. There are these so-called adaptive platforms. I won't spend time on this right now. These are a certain kind of clinical trial designs where you basically send 5 horses in the race simultaneously with a single placebo group, a control group. And whichever horse starts winning, in quotation marks, you add more patients into that arm, you randomize asymmetrically. And there's a whole mathematics behind this, as you might imagine. And these are referred to often as adaptive trials or adaptive platforms. They would be almost ideally suited for what I'm telling you, because we have so many different ideas and so many different drugs to catch up on. These other things that I'm telling you about are technology related things. We can get patients to report outcomes back. The second last bullet, for example. We can use all kinds of methods of artificial intelligence for machine learning and so on to prognosticate, to predict, and to monitor what happens in a given patient. And then there are some very sophisticated tools, the third bullet here, which allow us to very deeply probe what is going on at every cell, literally every cell in the blood. These are often referred to as single cell methodologies that have really come into the fore in the last few years. All of these can be applied in what we're talking about now. So these are then the two basic approaches. And I just want to mention some of the challenges. The first approach in trials, again, the big question, who will fund? Where to conduct, we talked about that briefly. The different platforms, the different methods of doing this. How do you incentivize physicians to do this? Because pharma pays a lot more money per patient enrolled than what we might be able to afford. If you do this in the community, there is a regulatory burden. There are forms to be filled out, excuse me, at least in the US. And I suspect the same is true in India. And docs that are busy in private practice are not used to this kind of thing and don't necessarily want to do it. The idea of these financial orphan treatments coupled to registry, again, there is a lower regulatory burden because each physician doing this does not need an IRB permission. And here we need permission to set up the registry and have ways of delivering data into the registry. But still there are barriers here, what to treat, how long to treat, peer pressure, et cetera, and of course, financial considerations. Who pays for the treatment, for example? So here is, let me just give you a few examples quickly. So here is my single slide. You can learn all of cancer treatment in one slide in 30 seconds. So the basic thing that everybody needs to know is when there is a diagnosis of cancer, the physician wants to know whether the disease is metastatic, meaning has spread, especially to major organs, or whether the disease is so-called loco-regional. For loco-regional disease, the general care is to undergo surgery, in some cases radiation therapy, plus minus, some cases chemotherapy, some cases so-called targeted therapies, in some cases immunotherapy. And the goal is to cure. And the survival rate over 5 years varies enormously, but roughly speaking is in the 50 to 90 plus range. Often, unfortunately, the disease can come back, but the worst situation is if it comes back, but doesn't come back locally, but comes back and has already spread into distant organs. And these are very rough numbers. If the disease has spread into the brain, typically survival is a few months. If it's spread into the liver or lung, no matter where it starts, typical survival is a couple of years. If it's in the bones only, the survival can be several years. But the 5-year survival, very roughly, is in the 5 to 50% bracket. The therapies that then one undergoes are listed here. I point to this little circle because there is so-called first line. There is a response of a certain number of patients, typically 25 to 50% of patients respond, and it's not 100%. And then typically, unfortunately, there is relapse, meaning the tumor comes back even if it has responded. And then the next third lines and fourth lines, the number of responses are even lower. They're typically in the single digit kind of bracket. And unfortunately, they typically last only a few months. So most patients with metastatic disease don't do well. There is progressive disease and death. A few are cured. So our focus in Morningside has been on the upper left, on loco-regional disease. Are there things we can do at the time of surgery that we would need to implement only for a few days before surgery, at the time of surgery, and for a few days afterwards, that would make a long-term impact, meaning prevent recurrence of disease. Now, this is a big deal. The reason it's a big deal is of the US cases, 1.6 million new cancer cases every year, the vast majority, 90%, fall under loco-regional disease. That's good news. The bad news is that when they do recur as metastatic disease, because the number is so large, they represent the largest number of deaths in the United States. So for example, of 40,000 new, 40,000 breast cancer deaths in the US, 30,000 of those 40,000 women first came to the doctor with only loco-regional disease. So if we could address the issue of what happens after surgery, in that scenario, we would save a countless number of lives. In the case of breast cancer, 3/4 of the deaths would be diminished. What I'm telling you is that there are a dozen or so drugs, each of which costs a few pennies, for which I can show you data that intervening at that time might make a difference in cancer recurrence. I'm not going to spend time on those today, but that is a whole area, a whole platform of interventions that could be done today. And of the 1.4 million cases that are treated for loco-regional disease in the US, today we learn essentially nothing more than what is done every single day as a standard of care. We could implement a dozen or so of these interventions, and if we just follow what happens, we would learn an enormous amount. Now, in the case of advanced disease, I'm going to show you some interventions in the case of advanced disease. In other words, a metastatic disease. So here are some examples. Example number one. So if I just showed you these two curves, so what are these curves? So these are the number of on the y-axis is the proportion of patients whose disease has not progressed. In other words, has remained stable or has shrunk. And the timeline is on the horizontal axis. There are two drugs that are used in this intervention. One is called Nivo and one is called Ipi. Each of these drugs costs $100,000 each for treatment. And these are all patients with a very high chance of not doing well. They are all kidney cancer patients. And this is from a randomized trial in which those patients were given roughly, it was a 2-to-1 randomization. They were given an entity, which I'll refer to here as CBM588. I will tell you what CBM588 is in just a few seconds. But all I want you to appreciate here is that those patients in the dark gray who got randomized to the treatment arm obviously did quite a bit better. Their disease in terms of recurring was much less than those who, disease in terms of growing, progressing was much less. They were doing much better compared to the control arm, which is the one in dark, one in blue. I mean, this is an enormous difference. You can see this difference from the back of an auditorium. This does not require a statistician to tell you that this is better. So what is CBM588? It is a probiotic. I'll show you that, I'll tell you that in just a second. But here is other data. Here is survival data on the right-hand side. So you might say, well, we know the cancer progresses, but do they die sooner? And what this is telling you is that there is a survival advantage, proportion surviving versus years. And then there are the so-called, on the bottom right, there are the so-called waterfall plots, which basically tell you, they measure a certain number of the tumor size, a certain number of lesions, and then they graph out who does well. And those are the folks who basically are on the right, extreme bottom right, in gray. You see the gray ones are the ones whose tumor is shrinking, in general, not always. And the blue ones are the ones whose tumor tends to be expanding. So these are referred to as waterfall plots. So this is a paper published in one of the world's top journals, Nature Medicine. And the CBM588 is the most commonly used probiotic in South Asia. And it basically is marketed in Japan. It is available on Amazon, it turns out. You have to do some fiddling around. But there it is. Now this data is going to sit here for the next 10 years. I can assure you of that. Because the company that makes CBM has never run a clinical trial. They sell probiotics. And there's no money the extra money they would make for cancer is trivial compared to the money they already make. And this probiotic is used for any kind of gastrointestinal disturbances, et cetera, diarrhea and so on. So there's no incentive for this generic company to make this, to do a trial and spend the millions that will be required to firmly validate this. In the meantime, as a patient, we feel it is our obligation, and in our database, this will be there if one had kidney cancer, to at least tell the patients this is available and to ask the patient to ask their physician, what do you think? Is there a downside? Is there an upside? Is this reasonable for me? In fact, it turns out that years before, in 2020, in fact, there was data retrospectively that if you happen to take this probiotic, your outcomes, not in kidney cancer, but in lung cancer, were much better. This data was sitting there from 2020. And I'm sure the original data was gathered even before that and was promulgated in meetings. Yet nobody had done the randomized study. So at least a small study was done in the kidney cancer area, but there was data waiting for several years. And there is data like this that fills our database and causes us a great deal of anguish when we see it. Example number 2. You can see here on the curves on the left, this is from a paper that came out also recently, about 2 years ago, that patients with melanoma treated with this particular drug, this is an immunotherapy drug. It is one of the 2 drugs that I just showed you data on. If you have melanoma or if you have lung cancer, and if you happen to be on an antihistamine, and I will be surprised if the majority of people on this call have not taken antihistamines. These cost a few pennies, as you know, and they're widely available in the world. There are many different kinds of antihistamines for allergies and so on. It turns out that the survival is better in lung cancer and it is better in melanoma. If you happen to have those diseases and are treated with immunotherapy, if you also happen to be on an antihistamine, you do better. And in fact, it depends on your histamine level. So if you look on the right-hand side, this is again one of those waterfall plots. In 60 different patients with lung cancer, breast cancer, and colon cancer, if you happen to have high levels of histamine in your blood at the time your cancer therapy is started, you don't do well. You don't respond. All suggesting that it would be nice for those subset of patients, it might be reasonable to give them an antihistamine. It doesn't prove it. A randomized study needs to be done. It is waiting to be done. It has not been done. Example 3. Again, take a look at these 2 curves. I'll tell you what they pertain to in just a minute. The curve in purple is an intervention that costs a few pennies. The curve in red is the current standard of care. We are talking about patients with brain tumors, with tumors that have metastasized to the brain. I told you a few minutes ago that generally those folks live at a median for about 6 months. Here you see the red curve. The median survival is approximately 3 to 4 months. If they do this intervention, you can see that 60 to 70% of them are living for 4 years. Now, this is as dramatic an effect as you can see in any trial. So what is this? This is also a paper published in one of the world's top journals, Science Advances. And the drug in this case is a supplement that you can buy on Amazon. It's a pure compound. It's an amino acid called arginine. You can see the title. Arginine enhances the effect of radiation in brain metastases. This is one study from Cornell. It's a solid study. It's published in an outstanding journal. It is waiting to be acted on. And we are about to start a trial at Emory. In fact, with this, also trying to understand how arginine might be working. There are many different theories as to how it works. So this is a study in 63 patients and is waiting to be enlarged on further. So these trials could all start tomorrow. And they could also be, one could start these treatments tomorrow, literally. And especially if you couple them to registries, I think we would learn something. So we are in the early stages of trying to set up this idea of treatments with a registry. We're trying to get this concept advanced at Emory. I'll be honest with you, there's a fair amount of resistance for a whole variety of reasons that are spelled out in this rather busy slide. But basically what we're saying is that these are patients who don't have time to wait. There's no time to wait for a clinical trial to start because it takes many months and sometimes a lot of money to get these going. So is there not a room to start treating patients with these ideas, fully understanding that there may be good or bad consequences, but understanding what that is and reporting out that in a national manner or collecting that data. So I won't spend more time on this, and I'm happy to provide you these slides, of course. So let me just take a second and sort of try to bring this to a close. There is an entity called long COVID that I'm sure many of you know about, and that is these are patients who have symptoms. They may have had them during COVID and they never resolved for many months, or there are new symptoms that come up many weeks or months after their acute COVID has resolved. There are many ideas for what causes these. There are many infections that in fact lead to these kind of syndromes, and they're called post-infectious syndromes. And we think long COVID is an example of that. And we are in very close contact with many in the community as to what they're doing. And so this is a very busy slide, but it tells you all of the different things that can happen. There are effects on the cardiovascular system, on the heart. There are effects in the lungs. There are effects in the brain. There are effects on muscles. And there are people who still have this, despite having had COVID for a year. There are people with extreme fatigue, with difficulty breathing, and so on and so forth. There are many theories as to why this happens. Some people believe the virus is still around. Some people believe the virus has caused irreparable injury in various organs. Other people believe there is nutritional depletion of critical vitamins and other things. So others believe that the virus that came allowed other viruses to get reactivated. So there are many, many ideas. And it turns out you can start forming some, you can take each of these ideas and ask the question, are there available drugs today that in fact could impact one or more of these in this conceptual framework? So we've been writing this paper for a little while, but we hope to publish a review of everything that's available today that we could implement along these lines. And we have done so, by the way, in a very small group of people. Many of these are physicians whom we know quite well at Emory, who are willing to both self-prescribe as well as ask other physicians to give them one or more of these drugs. Interestingly enough, histamine blockade is actually one of the things that people are using here. Again, we can have a longer discussion at some point. So finally, we want to get the word out. We've been fairly quiet for many years, but I think the time has come where we start talking about this at a regional level, but also at a national level. There is an organization called ACT at POC, which stands for Advanced Clinical Trials at the Point of Care. So these folks, it's a consortium of 6 or 7 universities, including us. And the idea is to diminish the administrative burden on physicians in the community who want to partake in clinical trials. So we are helping them design some of those tools. Connections to relevant governments and international agencies. We are proposing a concept which we hope to publish in a small paper. FFRDC stands for Federally Funded Research and Development Centers. So there are 40 of these in the US. And they basically are government sub-agencies that stand on their own with a defined sort of mission. So the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, for example, has a clear-cut mission. It is managed by the California Institute of Technology, and it is funded by an agency in the government. Lincoln Laboratories is managed at MIT, for example, and so on. There are only 2 such in the healthcare field. One is in the cancer arena, and the other has to do with improving all kinds of things that relate to better ways of different kinds of models for seeing patients. So we're trying to put a paper like this across, get it across to folks, and basically say this is time for a national effort. And the creation of an FFRDC might be one way to coordinate and fund such efforts at a national level. President Biden has an initiative called the Cancer Moonshot. We're trying to get to those people. There is a $1.5 billion initiative that is just off the ground that the administration has announced here. It is based on the DARPA model that some of you may know. There are key challenges that they want addressed. We are thinking of putting in a proposal to pilot some of the ideas that we're talking about to build the infrastructure and so on. We've been in some early contact with some folks in India, some folks in the UK. There are some people here. There is a consortium of cancer clinical trials. They are quite strapped for funding, and typically they don't do what we are doing, so we're trying to get them interested. Of course, large philanthropies and so on and so forth. So a lot happening on this front. And I think, when we started, Subbarao had mentioned, potential connectivity to India. And I think this is a real opportunity to do some things. So here are the folks who helped me. We have actually dozens of individuals sort of spread out all over the place who give us advice, who review papers for us, who help us design protocols. But these are some of the folks on the ground who spend, in some cases, part of their time, with the effort that we're making. So let me just close with that, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Vikas. That was very comprehensive and very engrossing.
Thank you.
There are obviously many questions, and I just want to kind of touch on something at a very macro level, if you will. I know you touched about it in different slides. Like you mentioned, there's no money in this for the pharma industry. And the pharma industry has a vice-like grip in the whole healthcare arena, not just in the US, but all over the world. And there are regulatory challenges also to be overcome, like you said. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of resistance, which is a mild word to use, from the established industry. How would you place this effort in the context of this framework? What are the chances of this moving forward? Because we hear scary stories of how very effective, affordable drugs being killed by pharma companies because they thought it would not yield the revenues that they were expecting.
Yeah, so Subbarao, you're raising another group of another set of opportunities. I've only referred to FDA approved drugs already, or existing drugs. There are drugs that are being shelved and have been shelved, either in phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3, either because they were not as effective or because they were impinging on other things that particular company, in other words, they would compete with themselves. So that's a very tough question. A lot of that is kept very quiet, obviously, as to why things were shelved. But that's another potential. So I was talking with somebody from Pfizer last night. Pfizer a while ago agreed to release a number of drugs that were not effective in phase 2 and phase 3 for what they originally started out those drugs for, but are willing to share the names and structure of those molecules with the public at large. Now, for whatever they want to do with it. Now, there are some strings attached to it, but at least they're willing to share those with some business strings attached, which I think is a step in the right direction. Frankly, I think another thing that could be done, and this would be a legislative issue, is that the FDA could say, we will not approve a drug moving into phase 1 studies unless that drug were available to everybody. In other words, stockpile a few kilograms of the drug for doing animal studies or any studies you want. Now, remember, the patent on the structure of that drug does belong to the drug company. But the FDA could, for example, insist that at least the drugs that move into humans, there is a ready supply of those to do whatever you want with at a preclinical level. And for that matter, even at a clinical level, understanding that the original patent still belongs to Pfizer or to whoever entity is. So FDA could do some interesting things along those lines. I will say that there are pharma companies who, for reasons of reputation, might want to support one or more efforts of this type. Just feeling that this is the right thing to do. There is a drug. So ivermectin was an example of a drug that was used for river blindness. Merck donated the money for that. And it's a commendable effort since river blindness has been essentially eliminated in Africa. Another place a pharma could come in is if we show that we can make their drugs more efficient. So the examples I just showed you, in fact, are all examples, or several of them were examples of where the pharma drug, which costs $100,000 for treatment, might be made more efficient by the incorporation of an antihistamine, for example. So pharma may be interested there. However, pharma worries, and what they want to really do is develop another $100,000 drug rather than the 2 pennies worth drug to add on to their original drug. So there are always two sides to this, and there is no simple answer other than to say that this is where the government representing the people has to step in and create a parallel agency, for the kinds of things we're talking about.
Right. Yeah, and one more, and then we'll take specific questions. And I think you touched on this, and Nitin also posted a question to this. And he may have mentioned to you that in January meeting, we had one Mr. Sriram of the testing lab that I mentioned to you, the government of US. He also spoke about how technologies can hasten the process of time to market of these new drugs. Now, my question is, in the recent COVID, the vaccine was made available to the world historically in the fastest time since vaccines came into play. Now, Sriram spoke to us about artificial intelligence, machine language, various other technologies which have speeded up the process, compressed the timeline you showed us. It takes 10 years for a drug to be really brought to use. Given that these technologies and the Chat GPT, the latest, social media is all about it. And we have a talk on that, I think, in June. Nitin's friend, he knows you also, right? Cheriana. So yes. How do you see this interplay? Do you, going forward, see that the drug discovery phase to the actual usage is likely to be compressed to, say, from 10 years to, say, 2 years or 3 years? And will that have an impact on the work that you and Vidula are doing?
Well, if we do trials the way we do them now, the timeline is not going to get compressed a whole lot. It could get compressed a little more if we select our patients carefully. You will not need 500 patients to show a difference. In the case of the antihistamines, for example, we believe that somebody's histamine level should be checked when they undergo the expensive therapy. And then if that subset, you won't need as many patients in the trial to show an effect if you find the right starting subset. So this is how a better understanding of the initial biology and the use of tools such as AI tools could help you to run the trial faster because you just need a less number of people enrolled. Let me make a provocative statement. The provocative statement is, I believe in 15, 20 years from now, the role of randomized studies as the gold standard, I believe, will start waning. We will look at a patient, a physician will look at a patient and do some fairly fancy testing and say, look, you look most like the following 750 patients out of a data set of 500 million. We know what happened to those 500 million people when they were treated with A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And you look most like these 700 people. And here's what happened to these 700 when they were treated by this. So I'm going to tailor your therapy, and this is often referred to as precision medicine. I'm going to tailor your therapy based on your next door neighbor, your nearest neighbor, if you will. So the role of randomized studies where we homogenize all kinds of populations and so on, and we believe is the gold standard, I think is on the chopping block. And frankly, it will help us. And that's why creating this registry that I told you about with drugs that already are available we are poised to make big advances in a multiplexed way, not a single trial. There will be, if we just did this and established this kind of framework, you would collect all kinds of data in a very quick time frame.
Got it. There's a question from our secretary, practitioners of naturopathy and yogic sciences, especially in India, I'm sure it's in other places, they claim to reverse the lifestyle diseases like, excuse me, let me just, like, hypertension, diabetes, and other, cardiac. And of course, there are some people who claim they have cure for cancer also using herbs and, or just, modification of your lifestyle and food. What is your opinion on this? How, true, or how is there a possibility that something like this is true?
Well, that's sort of a broad question. I mean, certainly chronic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, etc. There is lots of data on dietary modifications. There's no question about it. And we have not paid as much attention in our program on Ayurveda, on some of these other yogic practices and so on, largely because there is so much to be done and we have more knowledge of the kind of interventions we're talking about. But there's definitely a role for these things. And again, as usual, it needs to be looked at, with care. I mean, the Ayush framework in India is, of course, major goal is to do that. We've been in touch with some folks there. Again, at the end of the day, this is something that needs to be done. And a lot of these, it would make sense not necessarily to do a randomized study. Again, I'm being, my peers would not like me to say that, but the downside of doing pranayam or doing any of there's very little downside, and there's already some established upside. So it's kind of a shame that we have to subject some of these things to these kind of studies that then, are not funded or take, time to do. So there are definite opportunities there. As far as cancer and herbal products and so on, that's a whole discussion in itself. I believe there will be some, there are some promising possibilities, but because these tend to be mixtures, herbal products, they're hard to quantify. So we have tended, as supplements, we have tended to focus on pure molecule supplements rather than herbal products. But again, with what we are able to measure these days, one could run a small study with one or more of these things and quickly find out in the blood of a cancer patient what kinds of alterations have occurred in a very sophisticated manner very quickly, and would then at least put some of these on a more scientific footing.
Yeah, Mr. Ramaya wants to know that, currently a vaccine is available for cervical cancer, I understand. Are vaccines available for other forms of cancer presently?
The short answer, let me just think. So the cervical cancer, the reason a vaccine is available is because there is a causative agent that accounts for most of those cancers, and that is the virus called HPV. And so it's called the human papilloma virus. There are subtypes of that virus that are implicated in cervical cancer as well as in oropharyngeal cancer. And so the vaccine is basically directed at mounting an immune response against HPV, and therefore is quite effective. There are many other cancers which have no obvious infectious etiologies. And so overall, I'm not aware of any other cancer vaccines. There's BCG, but that is not, it is used as an anti-cancer drug, an intervention, but it's a vaccine against TB, of course. Vidula, do you know of any that I may have missed, or anybody else?
Not for prevention of cancer that I know of. I know there was some work going on for prostate cancer at one time, but again, it was after you got the cancer, not to prevent it, that we know of.
Yeah. There is a lot of effort now going on in cancer-specific immunotherapies. That is, trying to heighten the immune system against the cancer. And so a piece of that is to expose the cancer in the right way to the system. And that sometimes is referred to as cancer vaccines. So there's a lot of effort going on there. But in terms of available vaccines for primary prevention, this is the only one that I'm aware of, is the cervical cancer vaccine.
That brings me to the next question. Just in terms of the diagnostic tools, for detection of cancer at an earlier stage, as opposed to, stage 3 or 4, could you speak a little to the advances in that? What is in the offing?
Oh, absolutely. No, this is an incredibly exciting area, because what this will do, in the good side of this, is what this will do is will allow for earlier detection, as you said. There are several kinds of tests. One is actually cancer cells that are in the circulation in very small numbers. There is technology to look for those kinds of cells based on certain markers. Again, whether it detects all kinds of cancers or only certain kinds of cancers, people are working on that. There is another whole level of testing, which is often referred to as circulating tumor DNA or circulating free tumor DNA. So cancer cells are dying and proliferating at the same time. Some are dying, some are, growing, so to speak. And the dying fragments are shared into the circulation. And there are ways and ways of identifying those fragments from non-cancer cell fragments. So that is an extremely hot area. And the current data suggests that one could pick up cancers 6 months in advance, for example, or even a year in advance. And that's typically being looked at in patients who already have cancer, but it was locally resected. And then the worry is that it's coming back. So you can periodically do these tests. And what people are finding is that some of these tests can pick up the cancer ahead of time. The whole issue of, you have to ask what a given test is going to be used for. Is it for primary detection, in which case it has to have certain properties? Or is it for prevention of, or is it for detection of patients who already have cancer and have been treated for it? So the characteristics of those tests vary quite a bit. So a lot of companies are working on this. It's an extremely hot area. And I think we will see advances. The bad news is that, what do you do, right? If you are, you had cancer, it's been removed, and now the test is positive. We don't know where the new cancer is. None of our CT scans or PET scans help you figure that out. It could lead to a lot of worrying, needless to say, but at the same time, that is how things will progress. And we will at least have identified a group that could be treated with one or more things sooner than later. Or we can look for more tighter vigilance, if you will, to pick up a tumor that we think we can address. So a lot happening in that space, but still a ways to go.
Just a corollary to that, telemedicine, given the nature of the demographics in India, large population still is in the villages, though there's been improvement, access to Medicare or diagnostic facilities is still difficult. So is there a possibility, or is there innovation or development in these diagnostic tools being used remotely to detect patients, using, your internet, whatever the telecommunication facilities? Is there any work being done in this?
No, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So, again, you have to define are the tests that so one is technology itself that can, so for example, your red blood cell count, or in other words, do you have anemia or not, this is not just relevant to cancer, but could be relevant to all kinds of other diseases. There is now a little gadget that you can attach to your cell phone, and you can put it on your fingers, and it will tell you what your hemoglobin is. Non-invasively, no blood test required. All right. And that, of course, can then be transmitted by telemedicine to a central place. Would provide an initial screen for anybody with anemia. So similarly, there will be other tests that will evolve like this. But no, this is a big deal. I mean, having telemedicine and having a central way in which to place these results, this is a big deal. A lot of technologies will, and in some cases, a drop of blood is needed. There's a company in the US called TASO, T-A-S-S-O. Basically, they send you a tube. It comes to your house, and you slap on this little device on your arm, and it will, through these tiny needles, basically there is, blood is drawn. You take the gadget off your arm, and you close the tube, and you mail it. So this is in-home testing. You can do whatever test you want on that blood. It's just FedExed, to your home. and to the central lab.
My next question will be a little provocative, and I'm making this deliberately. There's this, many of us must have heard this statement which says, hospitals do not know about healthcare. And the way they describe it is, I think Dr. Arora is smiling. He knows what I'm about to say. Because he says the focus, at least in India, and actually the person also, the writer also says it's true for developed countries like US, and he cites a huge amount of the GDP spent, over 18% or 20% of the GDP in the US is spent on healthcare. He says more money is spent on the tertiary care and treating people who are already diseased, and that's the database hospitals have. There's very little money spent on preventive healthcare, sanitation, and other things. Any thoughts on this? Whether the more money should go into that? It's a difficult question. I mean, people are already suffering with cancer, they need treatment. But if you were in a position to choose, what would that be as a policymaker?
No, I actually don't think it's that difficult. I think there are too many other considerations that have gotten in the way, which is why it's made this difficult. If we have effective ways of prevention, that should be an absolutely top priority. And that's why on the cancer spectrum, for example, we have elected to focus not on primary prevention, because those interventions literally take millions in order to figure out, because the data point is 10 years, 20 years out, primary prevention of cancer. But we have taken the tack of preventing recurrence, which occurs in several years. So that's why I mentioned to you that we have some drugs available right now, which we could intervene in, which could prevent cancer from coming back in an advanced state. So, but back to the big picture, couldn't agree with you more. Prevention, incredibly important, has relatively been shortchanged in the US and abroad. In fact, I would go even further, and that is, there are sort of three states of health, if you will. One is disease, whether it's chronic or acute. And medicine tends to be a little better at treatment of acute disease than chronic, but that's disease. Then there is the well state, if you will, where our goal is to prevent you from being in a disease state. And that has to be defined, but that's the sort of well state. But I would even argue there's one more level. Mm-hmm. And that is, are we performing at a level of our best, at our peak performance? And there are now some people starting to think about that. So it's not just good enough to say, I don't have arthritis, or I don't have this, or I don't have that. Are you still able to function the way you would like to function when you were 20 years younger? So that's sort of a next level of optimization that some people are starting to talk about now, and which I think is a worthwhile discussion to have. A population that is at its best performance rather than just the avoidance of disease.
Right, yeah. That's the ideal state, I guess.
That's more ideal state, that's correct.
If there are no more questions, I'd like to end this with one from Nitin. He wants you to cite at least a single example anywhere in the world that you come across where an off-patent drug, FDA-approved off-patent drug, was introduced to make a significant impact in terms of affordability and efficacy, like what you've been alluding to. May not be cancer, but anything else. Are there examples?
So one example I would give is actually of a supplement, and that is folate. So as you may know, before folate supplementation became standard, more or less standard, there were babies born with neural tube defects. And this was this was an awful situation to be in. And then through a coincidence, this was actually a physician in India who was practicing obstetrics and gynecology who first noticed that in certain areas of India where there was a high intake of folate, there were less incidents of these babies being born with these defects. It took 15 more years after that before a randomized study was done in the United Kingdom and before policymakers decided to supplement various kinds of foods with folate before that was implemented. In fact, even today, that is not implemented in certain countries. So there are not a lot of examples. Thalidomide is another example of a repurposed drug. Thalidomide was approved as a sedative, unfortunately had bad consequences if taken during pregnancy. Thalidomide is a mainstay now of cancer therapy for a disease known as multiple myeloma. The use of aspirin is another one. There is quite a bit of data in certain kinds of cancer in terms of cancer recurrence prevention and primary prevention. Hasn't been sort of fully baked yet. So a lot of these ideas are sort of halfway there, but there are a few definitive ones that one should cite.
Great. And on that note, your thoughts on the latest rage in the US? I forget the name. Galvus Met, the metformin, is one drug which was initially, made for diabetes treatment, but I understand a lot of people are using it for obesity control. And there's a successor to that which has become even more popular. I don't recall the name of that drug.
Yeah, so these are drugs that are, so metformin is off patent, and people have been talking about it in cancer actually. Unfortunately, the trials done so far have been disappointing so far, but it's not clear that the right dosing has been used and right scheduling has been used. The other drug you're referring to is an on-patent drug. It's a new drug in which one can get very remarkable weight loss in a very short period of time. There are a lot of people very excited about it. Eli Lilly was the first one to market it, and there are several others now on the market. So that doesn't fit into any of the things we're talking about. That is a for on-patent drug. It was not originally for obesity, but it's clear now that the FDA is approving it for obesity as well.
Semaglutide, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have to get the names. There are several now on the market.
Right.
Yeah. It's an injection. Yeah.
Right. I think Captain Murthy wants to know, where does India stand in the world scene of medical research and pharma? I mean, he's truly appreciative of seeing you talk about this and, leading this kind of effort. So how much, people like you of Indian origin, what is the role, significant role they are playing in cutting edge research in this field? Any sense? No, anyway, outside India.
Well, there are many Indians in fairly high up positions in pharma and biotech. And I would also say that companies, so another whole group of companies, meaning Google and Microsoft and Amazon, they are making inroads into the healthcare space.
Right.
And it's not clear where exactly they're going to end up, but that's another whole constellation of places. And the reason I mention those is obvious. There are many Indian Americans in those roles, in very significant roles, in those companies. But there are many Indians in pharma that are not recognized as individuals because they were part of large teams that move drug development forward. I think there's a question here from Mr. Dr. Arora.
Yeah, he's also raised his hand.
Okay. Sorry.
Would you like to unmute yourself, Dr. Arora? He is Air Commodore Dr. Arora.
Good evening to everyone. Dr. Vikas, I've got one question point from you. Want your view also. Other day I was presenting is a global on pesticide use, and I have a huge data on that. It is going to cause like a pandemic of cancers in coming 10 years in the world. What are your views on that? Pesticides massively are used for good agricultural this thing, but there are dangerous, I myself have tested large number of these chemicals and all are oncogenetic.
Yeah. No, I don't have any wise words for you on that. It's not an area really that I'm an expert at, but I do worry about that. I mean, the environment clearly, if you add up all the various things from, pesticides to tobacco to certain kinds of sunlight exposures to, probably accounts for about a third of all cancers, I would say. And so it is a big deal. It's an enormous deal. And it's not just pesticides, there are also other things in plastics and all kinds of
microplastics. Your in-house use of chemicals is also causing these issues. I tested for pigeons droppings dry in causing of lung cancers. Tested it myself. It is causing. My daughter works in US in a cancer institute. One of the research, she has identified the chemical pathway from DNA to RNA and out and producing cancers. She was
Right.
able to block that chemical message, and the 25 cases of stage 4 lung cancer were given to her by the US government. They all returned back to normal.
Wow.
Wow.
It's
So
not
since
patented
sending-
now.
Something.
It's something unique. So she told me, she says, Papa, almost every disease I will be able to kill it here, because now I found out the, from DNA to
Good.
RNA, that chemical messaging system,
All right.
which you block it. And there are a lot of companies which are after her, ki we will produce these blockers. And
Okay.
there are huge blockers. You block the pathway and cancer regressed back to normalization.
In humans.
Humans, I'm talking about humans only.
Yes, that's wonderful. Yeah. So whenever you are comfortable, sharing the information, I'd love to learn. So
Now the US government has given her, right for colorectal cancers for armed forces of US. And
Right.
she says, ki, I will be able to hack it up. She did it for kidney cancers. She did it for lung cancer. Now she's going to go for a colorectal cancers.
okay. Well,
Very
that's
interesting.
exciting to hear.
So this is first time it has been, she could identify the pathway from DNA to RNA. And you block it, the message stop going, and the tumor start regressing.
Okay. Good to hear.
Thank you. I think it's 7:56, close to our ending time. Because it was fascinating to say the least, and I think you're doing some yeoman work, which humanity will thank you for in the years to come in posterity. So we do really enjoyed it and learned a lot. And thank you so much for spending the evening with us. May I now call upon our Joint Secretary to propose a formal vote of thanks. Somsekhara.
Yes, sir. President of FOSWL, Sri Venkateswararao, distinguished speaker, Dr. Vikas Sukhatme, FOSWLians and invitees. Thank you all for joining our 171st monthly meeting. We thank the family members of Sri Venkateswararao Tipirneni and Srimati Nirmala Devi Tipirneni for sponsoring the endowment lecture in the month of March every year. We also thank Mr. S.S. Prasad for the logistic sponsorship for the month of March every year in the name of his father, late Sri S.H.R. Krishnarao Garu. Thank you, Mr. Nitin Dalvi, for joining us from Atlanta, Georgia, USA, and introducing the distinguished speaker. Healthcare has made phenomenal progress in the past century or so, and especially in the past few decades. Yet affordability and accessibility to quality medicine is still a very distant dream for many in the world. Over 1 crore people die each year due to cancer. It is said, while cures are available for many forms of cancer, they are unaffordable to a vast majority of common people. The other issue is the expensive equipment required to detect cancer at an early stage. Given this scenario, Dr. Sukhatme talk provides hope, a whiff on fresh air, that all is not lost. His pioneering work to use existing drugs to provide affordable care and cure to cancer patients is not only a game changer, but an exemplary human endeavor. Thank you very much, Dr. Vikas Sukhatme, for spending the evening with us, actually from your morning, and sharing with us your commendable work. We pray that your efforts will succeed and provide succor to the suffering millions. A member asked us recently about the physical meetings. When we last sought the opinion from our members, the majority suggested to continue with the Zoom meetings as they find this format more convenient. However, We invite all members to email us their views on resuming physical meetings. Please send your message to the FOSWL email address. Till then, we propose to continue with these Zoom meetings. Our forthcoming meetings and eminent speakers are 15th April this year, Mr. Mayank Midda, founder and CEO of Garv Toilets, will speak on Swachh initiative and economic implications for our country. Next, 20th May this year, Anirudh Chavoji, founder of Bookmarks and currently advisor to the Department of Forest, State of Assam and State of Arunachal Pradesh, will speak on birds of a feather flock together and tell us about the fascinating Indian birds. And in June 17th this year, Mr. Anil Cheria, Executive Vice President and CTO, Strategy and Technology of Cognizant, USA, will speak on artificial intelligence and discuss how life will change in the coming years. Good night, ladies and gentlemen, till we meet on the third Saturday, 15th April, the next month, for our 172nd monthly meeting. Stay safe as we brace ourselves for the upcoming summer, though today it's rainy. Thank you.
Thank you, Somsekhar. Good night or good day to everybody. Thank you all. The meeting will now be closed.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.